The whiskey-soaked saloon in Vulture City, Arizona Territory, fell silent when Natalie Vaughn stood on a chair and announced she was going to build a schoolhouse for the town's children, even though most folks thought it was the most foolish dream they'd ever heard in 1883. Natalie clutched the worn leather journal that had belonged to her mother, feeling the weight of every dismissive laugh and sneer from the crowd below. Her cheeks burned hot as the afternoon sun that baked the desert outside, but she refused to let her voice waver. She had promised herself when she arrived 3 months ago that she would make something of this rough mining town, that she would give the children here a chance at education like she'd had back in Missouri before her parents died. "You folks might think I'm crazy," she continued, her green eyes scanning the sea of weathered faces. "But these children deserve better than growing up without knowing how to read or write. They deserve a future beyond breaking their backs in the mines or serving drinks in saloons." A portly man with a thick gray beard spat tobacco juice onto the sawdust-covered floor. "Girl, you've been here 3 months and think you know what's best for Vulture City. We've been doing just fine without your fancy book learning." "Fine. Half the miners can't even sign their own names on their pay slips," Natalie shot back, her auburn hair catching the light that filtered through the grimy windows. "They have to make their mark like children while the mining company cheats them out of fair wages. And what makes you think anyone's going to help you build this schoolhouse?" A woman called out from the corner. It was Martha Hayes, the general store owner's wife. "We all got our own troubles without taking on yours." Natalie felt her resolve wobbling but straightened her spine. She was 22 years old and had crossed half the country to start fresh after losing everything. She wouldn't give up now just because people lacked vision. "I'll build it myself if I have to. I've got my father's tools and these 2 hands." The laughter that erupted was harsh and mocking. Several men exchanged knowing glances as if they'd just witnessed the ravings of someone touched by too much sun. Natalie climbed down from the chair, her hands trembling as she gathered her mother's journal and headed toward the swinging doors. Behind her, she could hear the whispers and jeers following like shadows. "That girl's got hope enough for 10 people, but hope don't hammer nails. Give her a week before she realizes what a fool's errand it is. Pretty little thing, though. Shame she's wasting her time on nonsense." The afternoon heat hit her like a physical force as she stepped onto the dusty Main Street. Vulture City sprawled before her in all its rough glory, a collection of wooden buildings and tents that had sprung up around the Vulture mine. The town had seen better days, but it was home now, and Natalie was determined to make it better. She walked past the assay office and the blacksmith shop, heading toward the small boarding house where she rented a room on the 2nd floor. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who ran the place, had been kind to her, but even she had cautioned Natalie against being too hopeful about changing things in Vulture City. "Hope's a dangerous thing for a woman alone," Mrs. Patterson had said just last week while they sat shelling peas on the back porch. "Especially in a place like this where most folks are just trying to survive day to day." But Natalie couldn't help herself. Hope was all she had left after the fever took her parents 2 years ago, after she'd sold their farm to pay the debts, after she'd realized there was nothing left for her in Missouri except memories. She'd heard about the West, about the opportunities and the chance to reinvent yourself, and she'd used the last of her money to buy a ticket on the stagecoach that eventually brought her to this dusty mining town. The boarding house was quiet when she arrived. Most of the other residents were still at work or drinking away their wages in one of the town's 3 saloons. Natalie climbed the narrow stairs to her small room, set her mother's journal on the simple wooden table beneath the window, and allowed herself a moment of doubt. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was being foolish. She had exactly $47 to her name, no land to build on, and no support from the community. How could one woman possibly build a schoolhouse? But then she opened her mother's journal to a page she'd read 100 times, where her mother had written about the importance of education, about how knowledge was the one thing that could never be taken away from you. Her mother had been a schoolteacher before marrying her father, and she'd instilled in Natalie a deep love of learning and a belief that education could change lives. Natalie pressed her fingers against the faded ink, feeling connected across time and death to the woman who had shaped her. "I won't give up, Mama," she whispered. "I promise." A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She wiped quickly at her eyes and called out, "Come in." Mrs. Patterson poked her gray head through the doorway, her wrinkled face creased with concern. "I heard about what happened at the saloon, dear. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Natalie said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Just a little discouraged, I suppose." The older woman stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind her. "Natalie, you've got a good heart and your intentions are pure, but you need to understand something about this town. Most of these people came here desperate, looking for silver or gold or just a chance to survive. They've been disappointed so many times that hope feels dangerous to them. It's not that they don't want better for their children. It's that they're afraid to want it." "Then I'll hope for them until they can hope for themselves," Natalie said firmly. Mrs. Patterson sighed and shook her head, but there was a glimmer of admiration in her faded blue eyes. "You remind me of myself 40 years ago. Just please be careful. Don't let your hope make you reckless." After Mrs. Patterson left, Natalie changed into her oldest dress and retrieved her father's tool belt from beneath the bed. She'd been practicing with the hammer and saw in the evenings, teaching herself the basics of carpentry by repairing things around the boarding house. If no one would help her build the schoolhouse, she'd start learning how to do it herself. She spent the rest of the afternoon in the small shed behind the boarding house, practicing sawing boards straight and hammering nails without bending them. Her arms ached and her hands developed fresh blisters, but she felt better doing something productive rather than wallowing in discouragement. As the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Natalie heard the sound of horses approaching. She looked up from the board she was sawing to see a small group of riders making their way down the main street. Even from a distance, she could tell they were cowboys by the way they sat their horses and the dust that covered their clothes from long days on the trail. Vulture City didn't see many cowboys passing through anymore, not since the mining had overtaken most of the ranching in the area. These men must have come from one of the few remaining cattle operations that still dotted the territory, perhaps driving a small herd to market, or just passing through on their way somewhere else. Natalie watched them dismount outside the largest saloon, their movements weary but efficient. One man caught her attention, taller than the others with broad shoulders and dark hair that needed cutting. Even from this distance, there was something different about the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that contrasted with the swagger of his companions. She shook her head and returned to her sawing. The last thing she needed was to get distracted by a cowboy passing through town. She had work to do and a dream to pursue, regardless of how impossible it seemed. That evening, Natalie joined Mrs. Patterson and the other boarders for dinner around the long wooden table in the dining room. The conversation was subdued, mostly complaints about the heat and the difficulty of finding steady work. Natalie ate her beef stew in silence, lost in her own thoughts about how to proceed with her schoolhouse plan. "Did you see those cowboys that rode in?" asked Tom Mitchell, a young miner who occupied the room next to Natalie's. I heard they're from the Copper Ridge Ranch, driving some cattle through to sell in Phoenix. Copper Ridge. Mrs. Patterson perked up. I thought that place went under after old man Redding died last year. It nearly did, Tom said, soaking a piece of bread in his stew. But I heard his nephew or some relative came out from back east and has been trying to keep it going. Tough business these days, competing with the big ranches up north. Natalie found herself curious despite her determination to stay focused on her own concerns. How far is Copper Ridge from here? About 15 miles northwest, Tom answered. Why? You thinking of becoming a cowgirl now instead of a schoolteacher? His tone was teasing but not unkind, and Natalie managed a small smile, just making conversation. The next morning, Natalie woke before dawn with renewed determination. She'd spent half the night lying awake, making plans and calculating costs in her head. She needed land first, that much was clear. Without a place to build, everything else was just wishful thinking. She dressed quickly and made her way to the land office as soon as it opened. The clerk, a bored-looking man named Jenkins, barely glanced up from his newspaper when she entered. I'd like to inquire about purchasing a plot of land, Natalie said, trying to sound businesslike and confident. Jenkins finally looked up, his eyebrows rising when he saw it was her. You're that schoolteacher girl, aren't you? The one making all the fuss about education. I'm a teacher, yes, and I need land to build a schoolhouse. The clerk pushed his newspaper aside and pulled out a large ledger. Land ain't cheap, miss, even out here in the territory. How much for a small plot, maybe a quarter acre? Jenkins ran his finger down a column of numbers. Depends on where. Most of the land close to town is already claimed by the mining company or private owners. There's a piece about a mile out, near the old creek bed. It's not much good for anything, dried up most of the year, but it's available. $120. Natalie's heart sank. She had $47 and she still needed money for lumber, nails, and supplies. Is there anything less expensive? Not unless you want to build your schoolhouse 5 miles out in the desert where nobody can get to it. Jenkins leaned back in his chair. Look, miss, I admire what you're trying to do, but maybe you should think about starting smaller. Maybe just tutor some kids in your room at the boarding house until you can save up proper. It was sound advice, but it felt like defeat. Natalie thanked him and left the office, stepping out into another blazing Arizona morning. She stood on the wooden sidewalk, feeling the weight of impossibility settling on her shoulders. Excuse me, miss. Natalie turned to find the tall cowboy she'd noticed yesterday standing a few feet away. Up close, she could see he had gray eyes the color of storm clouds and a face weathered by sun and wind. He was probably in his late 20s, and there was something earnest in his expression that made her pause. Yes. He removed his hat, revealing hair that was indeed too long and slightly curled at the ends. I heard you in the saloon yesterday, about the schoolhouse. Natalie braced herself for another round of mockery or condescending advice. And I think it's a fine idea, he said simply. My name is Samuel Vance. I run the Copper Ridge Ranch, or what's left of it. I came into town to get supplies and heard folks talking about you. Let me guess, Natalie said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. They were talking about the crazy girl who thinks she can build a schoolhouse with no money and no help. Samuel's expression remained serious. They were talking about a woman with more courage than the lot of them combined. Takes guts to stand up for what you believe in when everyone's against you. Natalie felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Thank you for saying that, Mr. Vance, but kind words don't buy lumber or land. No, they don't, he agreed. But maybe I can help with that. She looked at him skeptically. Why would you want to help me? You don't even know me. Samuel was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "I came out here from Virginia 2 years ago after my uncle died and left me his ranch. I'd been working as a lawyer back east, living a comfortable life, and I gave it all up to try to save a failing cattle operation in the middle of nowhere. Everyone back home thought I was crazy. They mocked me for thinking I could make a difference, told me I was throwing my life away on a hopeless dream." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "But I came anyway because I believed it was worth trying, even if I failed. When I heard you yesterday, talking about building that schoolhouse despite everything stacked against you, I recognized something. Your hope gives me reason to believe that I made the right choice coming here, that believing in something bigger than yourself matters." Natalie felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. "That's a beautiful sentiment, Mr. Vance, but I still don't have the money for land or supplies." "I have land," Samuel said. "There's a good piece on the eastern edge of my property, right where it borders the road into town. It's accessible, has some shade from cottonwood trees, and there's a spring nearby that runs year-round. I'll deed you enough for the schoolhouse and a yard for the children to play." "I couldn't possibly accept such a generous gift," Natalie protested, even as hope flared bright in her chest. "It's not entirely selfless," Samuel admitted. "I have men working my ranch and some of them have children. Having a school nearby would be good for everyone. And maybe you could teach some evening classes for adults who never learned to read. I have a foreman who makes a mark instead of signing his name, and it bothers him something fierce." Natalie's mind was racing. With land secured, she could focus all her limited resources on materials and supplies. It was still a massive undertaking, but it suddenly seemed possible instead of impossible. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll come see the property," Samuel suggested. "If you think it'll work, we can draw up the papers. No strings attached, Miss Vaughn, Natalie Vaughn." She extended her hand and he shook it firmly. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip respectful but strong. "Miss Vaughn, could I give you a ride out to see the land? I have my wagon here and it's not far." Natalie hesitated, aware of how it might look to ride off alone with a man she'd just met. But there was something in Samuel Vance's honest gray eyes that made her trust him. Besides, she'd come to the West to take chances and build a new life. She couldn't do that by playing it safe all the time. "All right," she agreed. "Let me just tell Mrs. Patterson where I'm going." 20 minutes later, Natalie was seated beside Samuel on the wagon bench as they rolled out of Vulture City toward the northwest. The morning was still relatively cool, and the desert landscape stretched around them in muted browns and greens, punctuated by saguaro cacti standing like sentinels against the pale blue sky. "How did you end up in Vulture City?" Samuel asked, as the horses maintained a steady pace. "I lost my parents to fever 2 years ago in Missouri," Natalie explained, watching the scenery pass. "After settling their debts, I had nothing left holding me there. I'd always wanted to teach, but the schools back home weren't hiring women without connections. I heard about the West and the opportunities here, and I thought maybe I could make a real difference somewhere that needed teachers." "That's brave," Samuel said. "Leaving everything familiar behind to chase a dream, or foolish, depending on who you ask." Natalie smiled ruefully. "What about you? You said you were a lawyer in Virginia." Samuel nodded. "Worked for a firm in Richmond. Good money, respected position, everything I thought I wanted. But I spent my days helping rich men get richer and poor men get pushed around by the system. When my uncle's lawyer contacted me about the ranch, it felt like a lifeline to something more meaningful. Do you miss it? The law, I mean." "Sometimes," he admitted. I miss the mental challenge of it, the arguing and strategizing, but out here, the challenges are more immediate and honest. A fence that needs mending, cattle that need tending, water rights that need protecting. It's simpler, even if it's harder work. They talked easily as the wagon rolled on, and Natalie found herself relaxing in Samuel's presence. He wasn't like the rough men who populated most of Vulture City. There was an education and refinement underneath his cowboy exterior, but he wore it comfortably without pretension. The Copper Ridge Ranch came into view gradually, starting with fenced pastures where cattle grazed on whatever sparse grass they could find. The ranch house itself was a sprawling structure of adobe and wood, clearly built in stages over many years. It looked weathered but solid, like it had grown out of the landscape itself. Samuel guided the wagon past the main house and continued along a worn trail for another half-mile. Finally, he pulled up near a cluster of cottonwood trees that provided blessed shade from the climbing sun. Beyond the trees, Natalie could see a small spring bubbling from between rocks, creating a pool before disappearing into the ground again. "This is it," Samuel said, hopping down and coming around to help her from the wagon. "What do you think?" Natalie stood in the shade of the cottonwoods and slowly turned, taking it all in. The spot was perfect. The trees would provide shade for children during hot months, and the spring meant access to fresh water. The land itself was relatively flat and clear, requiring minimal preparation before building could begin. Best of all, she could see the road to Vulture City from here, making it easily accessible for families in town. "It's perfect," she breathed. "More than perfect. Are you certain you want to give this up?" Samuel leaned against the wagon, watching her explore the space. "I'm certain. I've been out here 2 years trying to make this ranch work, trying to prove to myself and everyone else that I made the right choice. But the truth is, it's been lonely and discouraging more often than not. The big ranches are squeezing out operations like mine, and some days I wonder if I'm just delaying the inevitable." He paused, pushing his hat back. "But then, I heard you yesterday in that saloon, standing up there full of hope and determination, and something shifted in me. You reminded me why I came here in the first place, why I gave up comfort and security for something uncertain but meaningful. Your hope gives me reason to believe again, Miss Vaughn. It reminds me that trying matters, even when the odds are against you." Natalie felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You can't put that kind of expectation on me, Mr. Vance. What if I fail? What if I build this schoolhouse and no one sends their children? What if I run out of money halfway through and end up with nothing but a half-finished building and broken dreams?" Samuel pushed off from the wagon and walked toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. "Then you'll have tried, and that's more than most people ever do. But I don't think you're going to fail, Miss Vaughn. I think you're going to succeed, and you're going to change lives in the process, including mine." The intensity in his eyes made Natalie's heart beat faster. She barely knew this man, yet he seemed to see something in her that even she wasn't sure existed. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I should get back to town," she said, suddenly needing space to process everything that was happening. "I have a lot to think about and plan." "Of course." Samuel helped her back into the wagon, and they made the return journey in companionable silence. But Natalie's mind was racing with possibilities and plans, and underneath it all was an awareness of the man beside her that had nothing to do with schoolhouses or land deeds. Over the next week, Samuel came into town twice more, each time seeking out Natalie to discuss details about the land transfer and offer suggestions for the schoolhouse construction. He introduced her to his ranch foreman, a weathered man named Charlie who had construction experience from his younger days. Charlie agreed to help with the building in exchange for evening reading lessons once the school was up and running. Natalie found herself looking forward to Samuel's visits more than she wanted to admit. They would meet at the boarding house parlor or walk through town discussing plans, and each conversation revealed more layers to the serious cowboy who had seen something in her worth believing in. "You're getting sweet on that rancher," Mrs. Patterson observed one evening after Samuel had left. "Don't bother denying it. I see how your face lights up when he comes calling." "He's helping me build the school," Natalie protested weakly. "That's all." "Sure, dear, and I'm the Queen of England." The older woman patted her hand kindly. "There's nothing wrong with it, you know. He's a good man from what I can tell, and you deserve happiness." But Natalie wasn't sure she deserved anything beyond the chance to fulfill her dream of building the schoolhouse. Romance felt like a distraction she couldn't afford, especially not with someone like Samuel Vance, who had his own struggles and uncertainties. 2 weeks after their first meeting, the land papers were signed and filed at the county office in Phoenix. Natalie now owned a 1/4 acre of prime land, courtesy of Samuel's generosity. The news spread through Vulture City quickly, and reactions were mixed. Some people, like Tom Mitchell and a few of the younger miners, expressed cautious support. Others remained skeptical or actively hostile to the idea. Martha Hayes from the general store made it clear she thought Natalie was taking advantage of a lonely rancher's foolish generosity. "Mark my words, that schoolhouse will never get built," Martha said loudly enough for half the town to hear. "And when it doesn't, that poor man will be out valuable land for nothing." Natalie tried to ignore the criticism and focus on the next challenge, acquiring materials. She spent hours making lists and calculating costs, stretching her limited funds as far as they would go. She would need lumber for framing and flooring, glass for windows, nails and hinges, a stove for heat, benches and desks for students, and books. Even with the land secured, she was still at least $200 short of what she needed. She took a job cleaning the saloon in early mornings before most people were awake, swallowing her pride and scrubbing floors for 50 cents a day. It was humbling work, but it was honest, and every penny counted. Samuel found out about her saloon work and showed up one morning while she was on her hands and knees scrubbing dried tobacco juice from the floor. "This isn't right," he said, his voice tight with something that might have been anger or concern. Natalie sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with her sleeve. "I need the money, Mr. Vance. The land was incredibly generous, but I still need materials and supplies. Samuel, please call me Samuel." He crouched down beside her, unmindful of the dirty floor. "And let me help more. I can advance you money for the lumber and you can pay me back after the school is running." "No," Natalie said firmly. "You've already done so much. I won't start this school by being in debt to anyone. I'll earn the money myself, even if it takes longer." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might argue, but then his expression softened. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met." "I prefer determined," Natalie corrected, managing a smile despite her aching knees and dirty hands. "Stubborn," Samuel insisted, but there was warmth in his gray eyes. "Fine. But let me at least help with the labor. I'm decent with a hammer and I can bring some of my ranch hands when they have time off. That'll save you the cost of hiring builders." Natalie wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her independence and prove she could do this alone. But practicality won out over pride. "Thank you. That would help tremendously." As summer blazed across the Arizona territory, Natalie continued her grueling schedule of teaching informal lessons to a handful of interested children, cleaning the saloon every morning, and planning for the schoolhouse. Samuel became a regular presence in her life, riding into town twice a week with updates from the ranch or new ideas for the school building. Their friendship deepened gradually, built on long conversations about everything from literature to politics to their shared experiences of being outsiders in a harsh land. Natalie learned that Samuel had been engaged once back in Virginia to a woman from a prominent family, but she'd broken it off when he announced his intention to move west. "She said I was throwing away my future for a fantasy," Samuel told her one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch watching the sunset paint the sky. "Maybe she was right." "You don't really believe that," Natalie said softly. "Some days I do," he admitted. "The ranch barely breaks even most months. I'm competing with outfits 10 times my size and the market prices keep dropping. I work from dawn to past dark, and I'm not sure I'm any closer to success than when I started." Natalie reached over and touched his hand where it rested on the porch railing. It was a bold gesture, but it felt right. "Success isn't always measured in profit margins, Samuel. You're keeping your uncle's legacy alive. You're providing jobs for good men like Charlie. You're learning and growing and doing something meaningful with your life. That counts for something." He turned his hand over, gently clasping hers. "When did you get so wise, Natalie Vaughn?" "I'm not wise. I'm just stubborn and determined, remember." His laugh was warm and genuine, and when he looked at her, Natalie felt something shift between them, a recognition of feelings that had been growing beneath the surface of their friendship. But before either could speak, Mrs. Patterson called from inside about supper being ready, and the moment passed. By late August, Natalie had saved enough money to make a down payment on lumber from the sawmill in Phoenix. Samuel arranged for the delivery, using his credit with the mill to secure better prices. The day the lumber arrived at the building site was cause for celebration. Natalie stood among the stacks of fresh-cut pine boards, breathing in the sharp scent and feeling tears of gratitude and relief streaming down her face. This was real. After months of mockery and struggle and doubt, she was actually going to build her schoolhouse. Samuel found her like that, crying among the lumber with the biggest smile on her face. He didn't say anything, just pulled her into a gentle hug that felt like the safest place in the world. "We're going to do this," he murmured against her hair. "You're going to have your school, and those children are going to learn, and the people who mocked you are going to have to eat their words." Natalie pulled back just enough to look up at him. "We're going to do this," she corrected. "I couldn't have gotten this far without you, Samuel." His expression grew serious as he studied her face, his calloused fingers coming up to wipe away her tears. "Your hope saved me, Natalie. I was drowning in doubt and loneliness, questioning every decision I'd made, and then I heard you in that saloon refusing to give up on your dream. It woke something up in me, reminded me why I came here and what really matters." "What matters?" Natalie asked, her voice barely a whisper. "This. You, building something meaningful even when it's hard, believing in tomorrow even when today is difficult." He paused, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I know we haven't known each other long, but I need you to know that these past months with you have been the happiest I've had since coming to Arizona. Your hope, your determination, your refusal to let anyone crush your dreams, it gives me reason to believe in my own." Natalie's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Samuel, you don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know, whatever happens with the school or the ranch or anything else, knowing you has made everything worthwhile." But Natalie did want to say something. She wanted to tell him that she'd fallen in love with him somewhere between his first kind words and the countless hours they'd spent planning and dreaming together. She wanted to say that his steady presence had become the foundation she built her hope upon, that his belief in her had made her believe in herself. Instead, she stood on her toes and kissed him, pouring everything she felt into that single brave gesture. Samuel responded immediately, his arms tightening around her as he kissed her back with a tenderness and passion that made her knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "Natalie Vaughn, I'm in love with you." "I love you too," she whispered back, feeling the truth of it in every fiber of her being. "I think I have been for a while now." They stood there among the lumber, holding each other as the Arizona sun beat down and the cottonwood trees rustled in the hot breeze. It felt like a beginning, like something precious and real was taking root between them. Construction on the schoolhouse began the following week. Samuel brought 4 of his ranch hands, including Charlie, and together with a few townspeople who had gradually come around to supporting the project, they started building in earnest. Natalie worked alongside the men, her hands growing calloused and her skin darkening from hours in the sun. She learned to measure and cut, to nail boards straight, to think 3 steps ahead about what needed to happen next. Samuel was always nearby, teaching her patiently and stepping in when a task required more strength than she possessed. Their relationship was the worst-kept secret in Vulture City. They tried to maintain propriety, conscious of how impropriety could damage Natalie's reputation as a teacher. But it was impossible to hide the way they looked at each other, or the gentle touches they shared when they thought no one was watching. Mrs. Patterson was delighted, of course, and gave them her blessing freely. Some of the townspeople were genuinely happy for them. Others, like Martha Hayes, pursed their lips in disapproval and muttered about young people moving too fast. But Natalie found she cared less and less about the opinions of people who had done nothing but mock her dreams. She was too busy building her future, literally board by board, with the man she loved working beside her. The schoolhouse took shape slowly through September and into October. It was a simple structure, just one large room with windows on 3 sides and a small entry porch, but to Natalie it was beautiful. She could already imagine it filled with children, their voices raised in reading lessons or reciting multiplication tables. Samuel had been right about the location being perfect. The cottonwood trees provided shade and beauty, and the nearby spring meant the children would have access to fresh water. Several ranch families, and even some families from town, started expressing interest in sending their children once the school opened. One evening in late October, with the building nearly complete, Samuel and Natalie sat on the steps of the unfinished schoolhouse watching the sun set in a spectacular display of orange and pink. "I was thinking," Samuel said carefully, "about the future. About what comes next after the school is finished." Natalie leaned against his shoulder, tired but content. "I'll need to officially open it and start regular classes. I've been working on a curriculum and ordering books from back east. I'm hoping to open in January after the holiday season." "That's not quite what I meant," Samuel said. He shifted slightly, reaching into his vest pocket and pulling out a small box. "I meant our future, yours and mine together." Natalie's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the fading light. "I know I'm not much of a catch," Samuel continued, his voice nervous in a way she'd never heard before. "I'm a struggling rancher with more dreams than dollars, and I can't offer you the comfortable life you might have had back east. But I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone, and I promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of you. Natalie Vaughn, will you marry me?" Tears blurred Natalie's vision as she looked from the ring to Samuel's anxious face. "You're everything I never knew I was looking for," she said through her tears. "You believed in me when no one else did. You gave me the ground to build my dreams on. You loved me not despite my hope but because of it. Of course I'll marry you." Samuel's whoop of joy startled a flock of birds from the cottonwood trees. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her soundly. They sat there on the steps of the unfinished schoolhouse, wrapped in each other's arms, planning their future as darkness fell softly around them. They were married in early November at the small church in Vulture City. It was a simple ceremony attended by Mrs. Patterson, Charlie, and several of the ranch hands, Tom Mitchell, and a surprising number of townspeople who had come to respect Natalie's determination and Samuel's steadfast support. Even Martha Hayes attended, though she sniffed throughout the ceremony. Afterward, she approached the newlyweds at the modest reception in the church hall. "I suppose I owe you an apology," Martha said stiffly to Natalie. "I didn't think you could do it. I thought you were a foolish girl with impossible dreams." "And now?" Natalie asked gently. Martha's stern expression softened slightly. "Now I think you're a remarkable woman who made me ashamed of my own lack of faith. My sister has 3 children, and she's asked me to tell you they'll be attending your school when it opens." It wasn't a warm apology, but it was sincere, and Natalie accepted it graciously. "Thank you, Martha. That means more than you know." After the wedding, Natalie moved from the boarding house to the Copper Ridge Ranch. The ranch house was spacious but sparsely furnished, clearly a bachelor's domain for the past 2 years. Natalie immediately set about making it a home, adding curtains and rugs, organizing the kitchen, and transforming Samuel's office into a shared space where she could work on lesson plans while he handled ranch accounts. Living at the ranch meant a longer commute to the schoolhouse site, but it also gave Natalie insight into Samuel's daily struggles and triumphs. She learned about the constant challenges of ranching: predators threatening the cattle, fence repairs, water rights disputes with neighboring properties, and the endless calculations of profit and loss that kept Samuel awake some nights. She also saw the ranch through new eyes, understanding why Samuel loved it despite the difficulties. There was something honest and grounding about the work, about tending animals and land, about building something with your hands and sweat. It complemented her own dream of teaching in ways she hadn't expected. The schoolhouse was completed in mid-December, just in time for the occasional winter rains that turned the desert briefly green. The final touch was a bell that Samuel had ordered from a foundry in Phoenix, mounted in a small tower above the entrance. When it rang for the first time, clear and bright across the desert landscape, Natalie cried again, overwhelmed by the reality of what they'd accomplished together. The school opened officially on January 15, 1884. 12 children attended that first day, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Some came from ranch families, others from town, and a few from isolated homesteads scattered across the territory. They were a ragtag group, many of them never having attended school before, but their eagerness to learn moved Natalie to tears. She stood in front of her first class, looking at their expectant faces, and felt the weight of responsibility and privilege. These children represented the future of Vulture City and the surrounding area. What she taught them would shape their opportunities and understanding of the world. "Welcome," she said, her voice strong and clear. "This is your school. We built it because we believe in you and your futures." Some people thought it was foolish to hope that we could create something meaningful here in this rough place. But hope isn't foolish. Hope is what makes impossible things possible. And together, we're going to prove that learning and growing and becoming your best selves isn't just a dream. It's real, and it starts today. The children might not have fully understood the significance of her words, but they felt the emotion behind them. They bent over their slates and primers with determination, eager to master the mysteries of letters and numbers. Samuel rode over from the ranch during his lunch break that first day, ostensibly to check on a fence line but really to see how Natalie's first day was going. He sat on his horse outside the schoolhouse, listening to the sound of children's voices reciting the alphabet in unison, and felt something settle in his chest. This was why he'd come west. Not for riches or adventure, but for meaning. For the chance to build something that mattered, to be part of a community that was growing and improving. Natalie had given him that purpose when his own was faltering. Her hope had rekindled his, and together they were making a real difference. That evening, over dinner at the ranch house, Natalie told him about every detail of the day, her face animated with joy and excitement. Samuel listened, completely captivated, knowing he'd never get tired of seeing her this happy. "I have news too," he said when she finally paused for breath. "I finalized a deal today to sell 50 head to a buyer in Prescott at a good price. It's the best contract I've landed since taking over the ranch. Between that and some investments I've been making, I think we're finally going to turn a real profit this year." Natalie reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "I'm so proud of you. I know how hard you've worked for this." "We've both worked hard," Samuel corrected. "And we've both succeeded. You have your school, I'm making the ranch profitable, and we have each other. A year ago, I was alone and discouraged, questioning everything. Now I have you and I have hope again. Real, tangible hope for our future." As winter turned to spring, the school flourished. Word spread about the quality of education being offered, and enrollment grew to 18 students. Natalie also started evening classes twice a week for adults who wanted to learn to read or improve their basic education. Charlie was her star pupil, practicing his letters every night and proudly signing his full name for the first time in March. The ranch was thriving too. Samuel had diversified, adding some horse breeding to complement the cattle operation. His reputation for honest dealing and quality livestock spread, bringing more business his way. The financial pressures that had weighed so heavily on him began to ease, replaced by cautious optimism about the future. In late April, Natalie discovered she was expecting their first child. The news filled them both with a mixture of joy and terror. They were still newlyweds, still figuring out how to balance their individual dreams with their shared life, and now they were adding a baby to the mix. "What if I can't do both?" Natalie worried one night as they lay in bed, her hand on her still flat stomach. "What if I have to choose between teaching and being a mother?" Samuel pulled her close, his hand covering hers. "You won't have to choose. We'll figure it out together. Maybe you'll teach fewer days for a while, or maybe we'll find someone to help with the baby during school hours. Whatever it takes, we'll make it work." "You always make everything sound so simple," Natalie said, but she was smiling. "It's not simple," Samuel admitted, "but it's possible. You taught me that. When everyone said your schoolhouse was an impossible dream, you proved them wrong. When I was ready to give up on the ranch, your hope gave me reason to keep trying. We can do this too." Their son was born in late December, a healthy baby boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. They named him James, after Natalie's father, and he was welcomed with love and celebration. Natalie took the spring term off from teaching, using the time to recover and adjust to motherhood. But with Samuel's support and help from a young woman named Sarah from town who needed work, she returned to teaching that summer for a shortened term. It was exhausting juggling everything, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Natalie had never imagined her life could be this full, this rich with purpose and love. She had her school, her students, her husband, and her baby. She had built a life in Vulture City that exceeded her wildest hopes. The schoolhouse became a center of community life in ways Natalie hadn't anticipated. She started hosting evening gatherings where parents could discuss their children's progress, and townspeople could socialize in a setting that didn't involve alcohol. The building was used for church services on Sundays, for town meetings, and even for the occasional dance or social event. The people who had once mocked Natalie's hope were now her strongest supporters. They'd watched her turn an impossible dream into reality through sheer determination and hard work, and it had changed something in the town's character. Vulture City was still rough around the edges, still a mining town with all the challenges that entailed, but there was a growing sense of community and possibility that hadn't existed before. Samuel's ranch continued to prosper. By their third anniversary, he'd expanded the operation and bought additional land from a struggling neighbor. The Copper Ridge Ranch was becoming known throughout the territory as a reliable source of quality cattle and horses, and Samuel's reputation as a fair and innovative rancher grew. But their greatest success was their partnership. They'd learned to support each other's dreams while building shared ones. Samuel would help with late-night grading when Natalie was overwhelmed, and she would ride out to help with ranch work when he was short-handed. They raised their son together, teaching him about books and cattle, hope and hard work. 3 years after James was born, they welcomed a daughter they named Clara. She was strong-willed from birth, and Samuel joked that she'd inherited a double dose of stubbornness from both parents. The school continued to grow. By 1890, enrollment had reached 35 students, and Natalie hired an assistant teacher to help manage the growing population. The simple one-room schoolhouse had been expanded twice, adding a second room and a small library funded by donations from grateful families. One warm evening in May of that year, Samuel and Natalie sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching James and Clara play in the yard. 7 years had passed since that day. Natalie had stood on a chair in the saloon and announced her impossible dream. "You remember what you said that day in front of the land office?" Natalie asked, leaning against Samuel's shoulder. "About how my hope gave you reason to believe." "I remember every word," Samuel said, his arm around her waist. "I meant it then, and I mean it even more now. You changed my life, Natalie. You changed this whole town." "We changed it together," she corrected. "Your belief in me made everything possible. When everyone else was mocking my hope, you saw something worth supporting. You gave me the foundation to build on, literally and figuratively." Samuel turned to look at her, his gray eyes full of love and pride. "You know what the best part is? We're not done. The ranch is growing, the school is thriving, our children are healthy and happy, and we have years and years ahead of us to keep building and dreaming together." Natalie kissed him softly. "I never imagined I could be this happy. When I left Missouri all those years ago, I was running from loss and grief, hoping to find purpose. Instead, I found everything. I found my calling, my home, and the love of my life, all because I refused to give up hope. And because you stood on that chair and announced your crazy dream to a room full of skeptics," Samuel added with a grin. "That took real courage, or real foolishness," Natalie laughed. "I'm still not sure which." "Courage," Samuel said firmly. "Definitely courage. The kind of courage that changes lives and builds futures. The kind that gave a discouraged rancher reason to believe again." As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel and Natalie sat together surrounded by the life they'd built. The ranch stretched out around them, prosperous and well-tended. In the distance, just visible past the cottonwood trees, stood the schoolhouse where children's futures were being shaped every day. It hadn't been easy. There had been struggles and setbacks, moments of doubt and discouragement. But they'd faced everything together, their individual hopes strengthening and sustaining each other. The town of Vulture City had changed too. The school had brought families to the area, people looking for communities that valued education and improvement. New businesses had opened, and the rough mining town was gradually becoming a more stable, family-oriented place. Over the years, Natalie and Samuel's family continued to grow. They had 2 more children, another son named Thomas and a second daughter named Ruth. The ranch house was always full of life and noise, children and animals and ranch hands coming and going. Natalie continued teaching for many years, eventually training younger teachers to take over as she focused more on administration and curriculum development. The school became one of the best in the territory, known for producing students who went on to higher education and successful careers. Samuel expanded the ranch steadily, never overreaching but always improving. He became a respected voice in territorial politics, advocating for fair treatment of small ranchers and better infrastructure to support rural communities. But he never lost his love for the hands-on work of ranching, still riding out to check cattle and mend fences well into his later years. Their children grew up surrounded by books and cattle, learning to read at their mother's knee and to ride at their father's side. They absorbed the lessons their parents taught through example. That hope combined with hard work could accomplish remarkable things. That love meant supporting each other's dreams, and that a life of meaning was worth more than a life of ease. James eventually took over management of the ranch, proving himself a capable and innovative operator like his father. Clara became a teacher herself, taking over the school from her mother and expanding its programs even further. Thomas studied law like his father had, returning to practice in the growing town of Phoenix while staying connected to his family's ranch. Ruth married a neighboring rancher and started her own family, carrying forward the values of hope and determination she'd learned from her mother. As the years turned into decades, Natalie and Samuel watched their grandchildren play in the same yard where their own children had played. The ranch continued to prosper under James's management, and the school Clara now ran served over 100 students from throughout the region. On a warm spring evening in 1920, 37 years after Natalie had first announced her dream of building a schoolhouse, she and Samuel sat on their porch watching the sunset just as they'd done countless times before. They were both in their 60s now, grayer and more wrinkled, but the love between them burned as bright as ever. "Did you ever imagine this?" Natalie asked, gesturing to the thriving ranch, the expanded schoolhouse visible in the distance, the sounds of their grandchildren's laughter drifting from inside the house. "When you first heard me talking about building a school in that saloon." Samuel reached over and took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. "I imagined that you were someone special, someone worth believing in. I imagined that your hope might be contagious, that it might give me reason to keep trying when I was ready to give up. But this," he squeezed her hand gently, "this is better than anything I could have imagined. We built something good here," Natalie said softly. "Not just the school or the ranch, but a life, a family, a legacy. We proved that hope isn't foolish, that dreams are worth chasing even when everyone says they're impossible." "You proved that," Samuel corrected. "I just had the good sense to believe in you." Natalie smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We proved it together. Your belief gave my hope somewhere to take root. Your support gave my dreams the foundation they needed to become real. I couldn't have done any of this without you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the Arizona sunset painted the sky in familiar shades of orange and pink. The desert had been their home for nearly 4 decades, and it had shaped them as surely as they had shaped their corner of it. The schoolhouse Natalie had fought so hard to build still stood, expanded and improved over the years, but still fundamentally the same simple building where she'd taught her first class in 1884. It had educated hundreds of children, changed countless lives, and helped transform Vulture City from a rough mining camp into a real community. The ranch Samuel had struggled to save had become one of the most successful operations in the territory, providing livelihoods for dozens of families and producing cattle and horses known throughout the West for their quality. But more than these external accomplishments, Natalie and Samuel had built something more precious, a partnership based on mutual respect, support, and love. They had raised 4 children who carried their values forward into the world. They had proved that hope and determination, combined with hard work and unwavering support for each other, could indeed make impossible dreams come true. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their family called them inside for dinner. The long table was crowded with children and grandchildren, with laughter and conversation flowing as freely as the food. Samuel looked around at the faces of his family, at the strong sons and daughters he and Natalie had raised, at the grandchildren who represented the future they'd worked so hard to build, and felt profound gratitude for the day he'd heard a determined young woman stand up in a saloon and refuse to let anyone mock her hope. That hope had saved him from cynicism and despair. It had given him purpose when he was floundering, partnership when he was lonely, and love that had sustained him through nearly 4 decades of joy and challenge. Natalie caught his eye across the table and smiled, that same bright smile that had captivated him all those years ago. In that smile, he saw everything they'd been and everything they'd become. 2 people who had taken a chance on hope in each other and built a life beyond their wildest dreams. After dinner, as the family lingered around the table sharing stories and jokes, James raised his glass. "A toast," he announced, "to my parents who taught us that hope isn't foolish and that dreams are worth fighting for. Who showed us what real love looks like and how to build a life that matters." "To hope and love," everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Samuel and Natalie stood together at the head of the table, their hands clasped, their hearts full. The mockery that had once greeted Natalie's dreams seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by the concrete reality of everything they'd accomplished together. "Your hope gave me reason to believe," Samuel said softly, so only Natalie could hear. "And your belief gave my hope somewhere to grow," she replied, squeezing his hand. They had started with nothing but dreams and determination in a harsh land that seemed designed to crush both. But they'd persevered, supported each other, and ultimately succeeded beyond what anyone, including themselves, had thought possible. The schoolhouse stood as a testament to Natalie's vision and courage. The ranch testified to Samuel's skill and persistence. Their family represented the love that had sustained them through everything. Together, they had built not just buildings and businesses, but a legacy of hope that would ripple forward through generations. As the evening grew late and the family began to disperse, grandchildren hugged and headed home, children checked on livestock and locked up buildings. Samuel and Natalie found themselves alone again on the porch where they'd shared so many conversations over the years. "I love you," Samuel said, pulling her close. "I've loved you from the moment you refused to let anyone crush your dreams. I'll love you until the day I die." "And I love you," Natalie replied, wrapping her arms around him. "Thank you for seeing something in me worth believing in. Thank you for giving me the foundation to build my dreams on. Thank you for a lifetime of love and partnership." They stood there under the Arizona stars, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The desert night was quiet around them, broken only by the sounds of cattle settling and the distant call of a coyote. Inside the ranch house, the lights glowed warm and welcoming. In the distance, the schoolhouse stood dark but ready for another day of shaping young minds. All around them was evidence of lives well lived, of hope vindicated, of love that had conquered skepticism and hardship. Natalie had stood on a chair in a saloon and declared an impossible dream. Samuel had heard that declaration and seen not foolishness but courage, not naivete but hope worth believing in. Together, they had proved that one person's determination combined with another's support could indeed change the world, or at least their corner of it. As they finally headed inside for the night, arms around each other, Samuel looked back once at the land they'd tended and the buildings they'd constructed and the legacy they'd created. "We did good," he said simply. "We did very good," Natalie agreed, and they had. Through hope and love, through stubbornness and support, through dreams turned into reality, one board, one student, one day at a time, they had built a life that mattered. They had proved that hope isn't foolish, that dreams are achievable, and that believing in someone can change everything. Their story became legend in Vulture City, told and retold to new generations as an example of what's possible when determination meets support, when hope meets belief, when love provides the foundation for dreams to flourish. The schoolhouse Natalie built educated children well into the 20th century, long after both she and Samuel had passed. The ranch they'd built together stayed in the family, managed by their descendants who never forgot the legacy of hope and hard work their grandparents had established. But more than the physical structures that remained, Natalie and Samuel's real legacy was the example they set. That one person's hope can inspire another's belief, that together people can accomplish what seems impossible alone, and that love and support can build foundations strong enough to hold any dream. Years later, when Clara was an old woman herself, she would tell her own grandchildren about the day their great-grandmother stood on a chair in a saloon and refused to let anyone mock her hope, and how their great-grandfather had been the one person brave enough to believe in her. She would tell them how that moment of courage and belief had changed everything, not just for two people but for an entire community. "Never let anyone mock your hope," Clara would tell the children. "And always be the person who believes when everyone else doubts. That's how you change the world. That's how you build a life that matters." And the children would listen, absorbing the lesson, carrying forward the legacy that had started with a determined young teacher and a cowboy who saw something in her hope worth believing in. The story of Natalie and Samuel Vance became part of the fabric of Vulture City's history, a reminder that the town's best qualities had been built not just on silver and mining but on hope, education, partnership, and love. Their names were remembered long after they were gone, spoken with respect and admiration by generations who benefited from the schoolhouse she'd built and the values they'd both embodied. In the end, Natalie had been right to hope, and Samuel had been right to believe in her hope. Together, they had proved that dreams are worth fighting for, that love can conquer skepticism, and that two people determined to build something meaningful can indeed change the world. Their story was simple in its essence. One woman's hope met one man's belief, and together they built a legacy that lasted generations. But sometimes, the simplest stories are the most powerful and the most enduring. Natalie Vaughn had refused to let anyone mock her hope. Samuel Vance had given her reason to believe that hope could become reality. And together, they had built not just a schoolhouse or a ranch, but a life full of meaning, love, and lasting impact. That was their triumph, their legacy, and their love story. Hope meeting belief, creating something beautiful that endured long after they were gone.